And I would say to my 20-year-old self, fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a little tougher than you thought. But we have to come through this. Just as my parents' generation, and they didn't know Hitler was on track to lose. You don't know, but you do know that you have an obligation to do the right thing and fight like hell.
The impossible is possible?
That's the biggest mistake people make about politics, is thinking it's the art of the possible. It's actually the art of the impossible.
Elizabeth May won't stop fighting for the two loves of her life, the environment and Canada. For 50 years, the longtime leader of the Federal Green Party, who first came to public consciousness as a crusading activist in the 1970s, has been at the forefront of some of the most significant struggles for the environment and social justice of our time. Following a disastrous federal election in 2025, the Green Party was reduced to just a single seat in the House of Commons, her own. May then announced she'd step down as party leader before the next election campaign. Despite enduring political setbacks and betrayals, Elizabeth May remains committed to fighting against what she considers to be the biggest existential crisis facing humanity, climate change, while ensuring that her beloved Canada lives up to its core ideals. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Elizabeth May is a trailblazer. The American-born member of the Order of Canada has had a full and active life, both inside and outside of the political arena. A native of Hartford, Connecticut, where she was born in 1954, Elizabeth May and her family immigrated to Canada when she was a teenager in the early 1970s, settling in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. In the mid-70s and 80s, she led grassroots campaigns against aerial herbicide and insecticide spraying and uranium mining on Canada's east coast. In the 1980s and 1990s, she worked to protect the ozone layer, raised awareness about climate change and Indigenous land rights struggles, and the need for forestry and biodiversity protection. In the 2000s, she staged a weeks-long hunger strike on Parliament Hill to protest toxic conditions in the Sydney tar ponds, one of the country's most notorious industrial waste sites. And in the 2010s, she was arrested while protesting the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. 2026 marks 20 years since Elizabeth May became leader of Canada's Green Party. She's the longest-serving female leader of a federal party in Canadian history. In 2011, May became the first member of the Greens to be elected to the House of Commons and has been the MP for her British Columbia riding of Saanich-Gulf Islands ever since. Despite heading up Canada's smallest federal party, Elizabeth May has had an outsized role in shaping the Canadian political discourse. Elizabeth May, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be in bed with the elephant.
It's a delight to finally have a chance to talk to you once again. In 2014, you published a book, a manifesto, shall we call it? A policy document called Who We Are, Reflections on My Life and Canada. And in the opening pages, you wrote that perhaps Marshall McLuhan was right in observing that Canada is the only country in the world that knows how to live without an identity. For many Canadians, who we are is defined by who we aren't. We are not our closest neighbors. Is that what you still believe?
Well, yes, I guess I do. I mean, it's Canada's sense of identity is almost always saying, well, we're not them. We're not the United States. And certainly now, what's changed since I wrote that is that more Canadians than ever are saying, elbows up, I love my country. I know what my country is. And we're certainly not the 51st state. I think it's more than a nuance. I think we're discovering a more shared sense of what it is to be Canadian. And the identity is more about our values as a country that values community over selfish individualism.
And it's evident, it's very clear that you feel passionately about this country. As you mentioned, you grew up in Cape Breton on the East Coast. You made a life in central Canada and Ontario. You now live in the West Coast. You've traveled extensively, really, across this country over the last 50 years. It's evident that you have an enormous amount of affection for what this country is. But there's a little bit of lamentation, I sense, in the book. You write, it has become a habit to think we deserved our own good press, we being Canada and Canadians. Near the truth, perhaps, is that in many ways undeserved. U.S. environmental law has always been stronger than ours. Our international development assistance has always lagged behind that of our European partners. You note that we are wealthy and privileged with huge tracts of wilderness, but you say we create more solid waste per capita than any country in the world. In some ways, you think sometimes that maybe Canada is punching below its weight.
Well, we're certainly coasting on a reputation. The reputation is deserved, but we are increasingly resting on our laurels. So it is a reality that I think Canadians think we're doing a better job than we are. Again, in contrast to the United States, you think, oh, well, and especially with Trump, well, we're not them. We stand up for human rights, except we don't particularly. We're now prepared to cozy up to the UAE, although it's providing weaponry into the new genocide in Sudan. And certainly, as you quoted from the book, I mean, people are still very surprised when I tell them that as an environmental lawyer under Richard Nixon, the U.S. passed legislation, endangered species legislation, that's far stronger than the Species at Risk Act in Canada. That the U.S. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, National Environmental Protection Act, and environmental assessments in the U.S., all far stronger than what was initially passed here. And what was passed here is now subject to new legislation under Mark Carney that says we can break any of these things if we've decided we want to, build something big and we want to do it fast. We don't have to obey any of our laws.
How did you come to environmentalism? How did you come to the work that you did as an environmental campaigner in the 1970s?
I honestly don't know. My mom used to tell me that I had this very strong connection to nature for my whole life. My mother said when I was quite young, maybe not yet even 2, but I was a toddler, when I said to her, I don't like airplanes. And she wondered why I didn't like airplanes since I'd never been in one. And I said, I don't like airplanes because they scratch the sky. And that stuck with my mother. I don't know why it is that from my very earliest days, that maybe it's just because I grew up in the countryside. We had lots of animals. I grew up in nature and I connected with nature.
I think as a kindergartner also, were you not warning your classmates not to eat snow?
Yeah. Well, because of the strontium-90 from the atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. So that was even before kindergarten. That would have been, nursery school. My mother had taken on this responsibility that she felt as a young mother when she found that in these days, this is the Cold War, this is the mid-1950s, that the United States was exploding nuclear weapons in the atmosphere to test them, to make sure that in the arms race we weren't going to fall behind the USSR. So nuclear weapons testing was part of patriotism in the United States. I'd be in favor of nuclear weapons testing. And here was my mom suddenly, because she read somewhere an article that scientists were warning that nuclear weapons testing was distributing globally radionuclides that, like strontium-90, that in the human body would be received as though it was calcium, so stored in bones and teeth. And that's why scientists were saying this was going to cause a big increase in childhood leukemia, which is why my mom became an activist to try to stop nuclear weapons testing. And one of the things she did, of course, was tell us that in school it would be a good idea to tell the other children not to eat the snow. These kinds of things weren't the normal way all my classmates were growing up. And so, I was in the playground saying, no, don't eat the snow.
And then, of course, in the 70s, you become a member of a number of grassroots movements fighting against the spraying of insecticides, of various herbicides in Nova Scotia. You eventually join Friends of the Earth. Later on, you become, the head of the Sierra Club. But I'm curious as to how you ended up becoming a policy advisor to a conservative environment minister, Tom McMillan. How does that happen? How does someone with your pedigree end up becoming a policy advisor to a conservative government in the 1980s?
It would certainly have fluked, and it wasn't a job I ever applied for. It has to do, of course, with, as with everything, relationships. And because I become prominent in a small pond, right? So I was well known as an environmental activist in the Maritimes. So Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI. I was a well known activist in my early 20s. By the time I got to law school, one of my classmates became an assistant to his member of parliament in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. So my friend Rob Burnett was working for Tom McMillan, and Tom McMillan was recently appointed by Brian Mulroney to be his Minister of Environment. And then somehow between Tom knowing that I'd gone to law school with Rob, and I was at that point organizing a conference called Fate of the Earth Conference. So when the minister invited me, I thought it was about our request for funding for this big conference. And I found myself not in a job interview at all. He was saying, I want to hire you, and this is what your job would be, and are you willing to do it? So after some reflection and warning him, I said, I don't know that you want to hire me because you seem like a very good fellow, and I think you mean well. But the problem is, I'm the kind of person who would quit on principle. And if that were to happen, it would hurt you, and I don't want to hurt you. Well, it took 2 whole years before I resigned on principle when he broke the law, but I'm grateful to this day for that opportunity because nothing was more unlikely. And I never bought a membership into any political party, but if I had, it wouldn't have been progressive conservative or conservative. And so the progressive conservatives of that era are to the left in many ways, of certainly very much more left than where the liberals are today. But I accepted the job offer and found myself in the ultimate best possible job ever, where I was part of negotiating the protocol to save the ozone layer, where I got to work on things that mattered deeply to me, like acid rain. I never thought it was our Valhalla of achievement for environment, because I knew we weren't doing enough. But in contrast to where we are today, we've lost a lot of ground in ensuring we have a habitable planet, a shared concern across party lines and across jurisdictional divides.
Despite the fact that you end up leaving, as you mentioned, you end up resigning from your position on a point of principle, your position as policy advisor and speechwriter for Tom McMillan, did that experience encourage you to want to become more engaged in the political system? Like for some people, that kind of experience would have soured them on the idea of joining the system, that to join the system ultimately means to make too many compromises. So how did that experience of working, with the conservative government at that time change your attitude towards being at the center of politics?
Well, it didn't really. I mean, as a senior policy advisor to the federal minister of environment, when I took the job, I thought, if it's bad, I can always quit. I was not prepared to compromise on my integrity ever, and I didn't. That's why I left. But I quit my job with the government in late June of 1988. I didn't join a political party till 2006. And in the in-between years, I became executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, and Sierra Club's rules were very clear. You couldn't get involved in partisan politics at all. And I wasn't tempted over those years, but in that time, at different points, I had liberals and, for that matter, progressive conservatives, and often NDP leaders ask me if I'd be willing to be a candidate and be in parliament. And I never dismissed it out of hand. I'd wrestle with it. And I had a lot of friends who were members of parliament. I knew how frustrated many of them were. And I thought, I'm better off leading a national environmental organization that's making a difference. I'm making more of a difference than if I entered politics. So what changed wasn't my attitude towards being in politics. It was when Stephen Harper, who did not represent anything like anything I'd seen in government of the progressive conservatives. I mean, the Reform Party split, and then the Reform Party takeover of progressive conservatives was a shift not only to the right, but for the first time, we had a gap on environmental issues and issues like climate divided along left and right fracture lines. That wasn't something that happened at all in Canada in the 70s or 80s. It only started happening with Stephen Harper taking over the Conservative. I mean, Brian Mulroney was, as Prime Minister at the Rio Earth Summit, a champion for getting the treaty to fight climate change and fighting for the treaty to protect biological diversity. And as I said also, there was no daylight on environmental issues between many liberal premiers and federal progressive conservatives. Harper changed that and created, for the first time, partisan dividing lines on climate that these days people assume are naturally there. They're not. They don't occur in other countries. It started contaminating our politics from south of the border. Yeah, certainly the policies on climate that were put in place in the UK under Labour governments survived through conservative years and came out again with Labour governments. It's a North American problem, and increasingly it is spreading, this idea that if you're a right winger, you don't want to act on climate change. One of my people in politics I totally admired in the Progressive Conservative Party, former Speaker John Fraser, John always used to say, the route to be a conservative is to conserve. That's not out of keeping with where conservatism used to be, but is absent from the increasingly MAGA-style rhetoric of today's Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre. But there still are, and I know them, they still elected conservatives in that parliament who are deeply climate-concerned citizens, but this party line, top-down control within all the major political parties doesn't allow the public to see that they're thoughtful people who question even the rhetoric they have to spout as members of parliament.
When it comes to the environment, what in your mind does Pierre Poilievre not understand that Brian Mulroney did understand?
Oh, it's an enormous gap between the two men when you think about it. I mean, Pierre Poilievre, the style of politics that he's embraced is a product of rage farming, of social media algorithms that doesn't care if the idea you're promoting is based in evidence or not. That's irrelevant. Does it stir people up? Does it work as clickbait? Does it help you get money? Brian Mulroney, and for that matter, Margaret Thatcher, who was trained as a scientist, I think that the damage done by the neoliberalism of that era, of the anti-regulation and the privatization and trade liberalization, and that whole piece has done us a lot of damage as a society. But back to who they were in those days, people like Margaret Thatcher, and you couldn't have for more neoliberal right-winger, understood that climate change was a real threat at that time in the 1980s. It was a future threat there, where the science was completely clear that if you keep adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, you're going to destabilize global climate systems with the potential of destroying human civilization. We understood that then, and it was widely understood. So what Mulroney understood and what he applied on issues from acid rain to ozone depletion to climate change was the science is telling us that we have to act. Therefore, we have to act. You don't question it. And then Mulroney went to, of all people, Ronald Reagan, and insisting that they could do it, that we could do it together and end the scourge of acid rain. And of course, the ozone treaty that Canada led the charge literally saved all life on Earth because we stopped releasing chemicals that destroy the ozone layer. The ozone layer is now, and this is just science, it's repairing itself. But it doesn't sit on its rage-forming model that the conservatives are increasingly using, that just to make people angry is enough, to make them hate someone is enough, to make them blame some other party or some other group of issues or concerns, blame climate action and the very modest consumer carbon tax we used to have, quite wrongly claimed that that was driving inflation. And to my horror, even the people who put it in place in the Liberal Party and Carney's first act as prime minister is get rid of it. As an economist, he knows perfectly well that was the least costly and most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gases in Canada. Doesn't matter. It got demonized by slogans that rhyme, and slogans that rhyme carry greater resonance in the 21st century than mountains of scientific evidence. But in the 1980s, scientific evidence was enough to move politicians to say, well, we better do the right thing. That's our responsibility. That has gone by the wayside. We've become lackeys to whatever power there is in CEOs and transnational corporations and governments, regardless of political stripe. The NDP here in British Columbia, appalling, promoting more greenhouse gas emissions by fracking, and they have billboards on all our highways saying that liquefied natural gas is good for the environment. British Columbians basically know that's not true. And so we've declined in the capacity of elected leadership to actually govern with evidence-based solutions because our political system has become, unfortunately and tragically, more beholden to corporate interest.
Pierre Poilievre will say, Elizabeth May, you've got me wrong. I actually do believe in conservation. I count myself to be an environmentalist. I just believe that the solutions are to be found in the market. I have faith in the future. I have faith in technology. Technology will help us to solve these problems.
Yeah, techno fantasies aren't helpful. We've gone that route. Goodness knows that the notion that Justin Trudeau was a climate leader is belied by the record and the fact that he bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline and took $34 billion of public money to build it. I've never actually heard Pierre Poilievre make the case that they understand the climate crisis is urgent and that language like crisis should be used. As I said, there's a lot of Conservative members of Parliament who have become much more aware of how dangerous the climate crisis is when it hits their own communities and it hits their own riding. When Lytton burned to the ground in 15 minutes, the member of Parliament for that area was deeply affected by it. But we still have an election campaign. Certainly the 2025 election campaign was desperately devoid of concern for climate because polling told political leaders that there wasn't anything to worry about there, that the public didn't care. So linking the affordability crisis, as it should be linked, where's the evidence? Well, food becomes less affordable if you've been walloped with weather events that drive down the productivity of many, many different food sources, but certainly when you have vanilla beans become harder to harvest because of typhoons in Madagascar, and you have droughts that wipe out large sources of food from various breadbaskets, the obvious linkages between climate and affordability don't get mentioned very often. The fact that Canada's economy got walloped 2024, I don't know the 2025 statistics yet, but in 2024, the Insurance Bureau of Canada said, we broke all records with $8.5 billion of insurable losses. And obviously there's many losses that weren't insured. And there's trauma and ongoing heartbreak for people who had to leave their homes not knowing if they were ever going to find their home to come back to. These are not what we used to think of as environmental issues. These are security threats. And yet, here we are with this global scientific community being very clear that we're approaching tipping points that put the survival of human civilization at risk, and we're acting as if it's something we can kick down the road while we deal with more important matters. And you can't say, well, right now we're only dealing with this one thing, because in a polycrisis world, you actually have to come up with solutions that address more than one problem at a time, and you really can't afford to say, this issue, climate, doesn't matter because it's not registering in the polls.
Well, is one inconvenient truth that things are too far gone? That we are actually experiencing right now climate collapse and that there's nothing we can do about it?
That's not true, fortunately. The question, is it too late? I always want to say is the missing part of that question is it too late for what?
Well, your friend David Suzuki in an interview with iPolitics suggested as much. He suggested that the planet had passed too many thresholds and that climate change, climate collapse is inevitable.
Well, David Suzuki and I, we're really close friends, and we talk about this stuff, and he doesn't really think it's too late to avoid mass human extinction. And that is the worst case scenario that nobody ever wants to talk about. Why would you ever want to talk about that? Be in politics. You're so quick to want to say, you doomsayer nutbars, you invented some threat to the ozone layer. You don't talk about that anymore, do you? I mean, literally, how unplugged from reality can you be that this kind of discourse takes place in social media? Or remember how they used to carry on about acid rain and now they don't talk about that anymore? Yeah, we fixed it. Guess what? My God. The worst case scenario of the climate crisis is one that doesn't get spoken of because it's too terrifying. It is that if we don't reduce greenhouse gases, if we don't stop using fossil fuels and break our addiction to as many fossil fuels as we're currently burning, and we're on track to burn more all the time. If we don't change that trajectory, the worst case scenario is one where, and I think it's very important to say, this is not at this point inevitable. It's not too late to avoid what essentially is often called by scientists runaway global warming. So a runaway scenario is where, because of the global warming that we've unleashed through human activity, what are called positive feedback loops. A positive feedback loop being like every time our forests catch fire, the horrible feedback is that as they burn, they release more greenhouse gases than all of Canadian industry last year was released by our forest fires. That's a positive feedback loop. As our Arctic ice melts, it creates more warming because the dark ocean water absorbs more heat from the sun that normally would have bounced back into dark space because of the ice on the poles and the albedo effect. So the risk for future generations is that we leave our children with a world where global warming becomes self-accelerating and unstoppable, even if we completely go off burning fossil fuels at all. Like a cold turkey hard stop would not change a trajectory towards human extinction if we don't act now. My understanding of the science at this point is that we have not yet passed those tipping points. The most we can say is we don't know for sure. And while any of us who care about whether our grandchildren have a livable world, that requires that we reduce greenhouse gases as quickly as possible everywhere. Every fraction of a degree that we avoid in global heating will save millions of lives. So it's not too late in that sense. It's too late to have the lovely climate systems that existed. We've lost that. We're now locked in to at least decades, if not at least a century, of unstable climate conditions. We're locked into a time when we're going to see more forest fires every year. We're locked into a time when we'll see more flooding every year. But it's not too late to hold the levels of global warming to levels to which we can adapt with great effort and at great cost and not without loss of lives. But we're not too late to save ourselves as a species and to save as many of the millions of other species that share this planet with us. It's not too late for that. But it takes a major shift in direction from our current politics of dumb rhyming slogans that outweigh the evidence.
I was wondering if the approach that you and other leading environmentalists like David Suzuki have taken over the last 40, 50 years is part of the problem. Like if maybe scaring people or catastrophizing was not the right approach.
Well, I can tell you that at Sierra Club, we never did that. We're very aware of the threat. And I think, if anything, constantly saying we can get through this technology, we can make these transitions. I think we actually may have sugarcoated too much to make sure we didn't alienate people. And I think at some point, I mean, it's like, telling people the truth, but saying this is going to be hard. This is not easy. This is the extent of the downside risk. I don't think we've helped our cause by constantly doing the opposite of what you suggest we've done. I mean, David may have been, he's been more blunt. We're both pretty goddamn depressed with Mark Carney and thinking, where did we misread this guy? That's the question no one knows how to answer.
Does building new pipelines help to save us?
No, absolutely not. the suicide pact.
The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, said that any further investment in exploration for fossil fuels or building a fossil fuel infrastructure was moral and economic madness. Mark Carney was elected as someone who was seen as being, well, he was a financial wizard. He was someone who understood the dangers of climate change. He was seen as being the kind of the thought leader that the climate movement needed. He was seen as someone who could translate the reality of climate change into the language of finance. And yet, just in November, he brokered a deal with the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, a memorandum of understanding to build a new pipeline. You actually helped to keep his government afloat. You voted for his budget. Was that a mistake?
The budget vote was 10 days before the MOU.
Yeah.
Literally, you can look at page 348 in the budget. It says, enhanced oil recovery will not be eligible for subsidies. Black and white. I've never seen any other government in this country reverse a budgetary commitment within 10 days without any explanation, without any apology. No one from PMO reached out to me to say, we really appreciated your vote in the budget. Sorry we screwed you over. What? I'm absolutely astonished, and I remain astonished.
What have they said to you when you confronted them? What's their answer? Nothing.
Nothing. I saw Carney at the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner, which was the 29th, and the MOU was the 27th. And I didn't really even want to speak to him. And he came over, hand outstretched. So he said, how are you? And I said, well, pretty devastated. And his attitude was sort of, oh, come on, don't be like that. It was a very dismissive, just taking my hand so people could see we shook hands, and then a fake kiss to both cheeks. No, there's not been a single effort to say, we really owe you an explanation. If we could have done it differently, we would have. Sorry that it was in black and white in the budget, plus the words he gave on the House of Commons as a commitment. And I can't begin to, as I said, I've never seen a budget document with black and white commitment disappear like it was written in fading invisible ink. No, it was actually still there, still in the budget, just completely in contradiction to what's in the MOU. And I have to say it's beyond heartbreaking. It's shattering, and to me inexplicable. Because
but Elizabeth May, what did you? Because you clearly had faith in Mark Carney. You clearly because some of your critics would say, Elizabeth, that was the wrong move. We would not have done that. You decided.
Well, I don't know.
You clearly felt that.
Look, it was in black and. I didn't think it was possible, given as much of my life as I've had in politics. I could not think for 1 minute that a budget that in black and white said enhanced oil recovery is not eligible for these subsidies, that 10 days later they would become a commitment to the Alberta government. I'm almost speechless at the betrayal that occurred. Obviously, it was more than Stephen Guilbeault, as someone who'd been in the Liberal ranks and in Liberal cabinets since 2015, to quit cabinet. Obviously, as shocked as I was, so was he. But is it wrong to think that you can take someone that you respect, like Mark Carney, and take him at his word? Clearly, I was wrong. I cannot take him at his word. So that's a learning experience and a hard one.
What do you think you missed? So has Mark Carney changed? Or is it that people didn't fully understand what he was actually saying in his book Values?
I think it's probably the latter. I thought he was a thoughtful economist. And what I missed is he's mostly a short-term transactional banker. And there's a difference. The inference I drew from the fact that we couldn't seem, including media, couldn't seem to pin him down on whether he was committed to the Paris targets or not. And he was somewhat evasive with media, and he would say, well, I believe in results, not targets and objectives. I thought that he was evasive because he was a person of his word, and he knew that if he said, "I'm committed to reaching the targets," he would be honor bound to pursue that course. What I missed was he was not a person who thought it mattered what he had said or what he committed to, because in the same way that a banker would say, "Oh, the terms and conditions have changed since the last time you were in here, so we can't give you that loan we told you we're going to give you. You can see the term sheet has changed." I mean, I don't want to condemn every banker in the world, but obviously the banking background in Mark Carney's life was even more profound than his exceptional academic credentials as an economist, because an economist is bound to take into account a wide range of interests. I misunderstood, profoundly misunderstood, who Mark Carney is and what he cares about. It doesn't quite add up that we wouldn't be more or less on the same page in a desire to see climate action. Obviously, dealing with Trump, that's another thing where I'm quite surprised by Mark Carney, because I think he's abandoned elbows up in favor of, can we just get a deal?
And yet Mark Carney would say that he's defending the national interest, that it's in this interest of this country to grow, and that in order for the economy to grow, in order to deal with the threat represented by Trump's America, that Canada needs to exploit its resources. And some of those resources are in the ground in Alberta. And also, it's important to keep Alberta on board. There's this burgeoning independence movement in Alberta that Daniel Smith is feeling pressure from, and that in order to keep Canada whole, these kinds of compromises need to be made.
Well, you can call it compromise, you can call it a betrayal of future generations. I think we have an obligation to make decisions based on evidence. And the economic evidence is pretty clear that banking on fossil fuels into the future is not a good investment economically either. But we have to take care of communities. We've got communities right now that are suffering enormously from the tariffs on Canada's wood products, our forest industry. And when you look at the oil patch, for all of the gnashing of teeth from various Alberta politicians, oil production and production out of the oil sands went up throughout the Justin Trudeau years. They built with public money the Trans Mountain Pipeline because it wasn't a project that the private sector wanted to build. Kinder Morgan from Texas didn't leave because of too much regulation. They'd already decided this wasn't going to make any economic sense. I would go back and say that, because Albertans are sensible people. Why are you, as a province, why do you let your premier be so determined to ship out unprocessed bitumen instead of refining it in Alberta? Why don't we stop shipping in any oil from Saudi Arabia? Well, actually, the only customer for Saudi Arabian oil in Canada is the Irving refinery in New Brunswick. But why ship in any oil from other countries? We are exporting oil before we meet our own needs. I think most Canadians would like the idea that, oh, that makes sense. Why don't we use Canadian oil only? And then what's surplus to our needs we can export. But that's not the economic growth strategy of Daniel Smith, or now of Mark Carney, or for that matter of Justin Trudeau. It's been shipped it out raw. And very few people remember the history of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, that when it went to review at the National Energy Board, the biggest union in northern Alberta, Unifor, intervened in the hearings to say, don't build the pipeline because it's going to cost us jobs in refineries. Process it here. Use it here on a declining basis while we make the transition to a post-carbon economy. But the idea that shipping out our resources raw, hands over fists, build more pipelines, ship it out raw, it's not an economic growth strategy. It's a corporate greed strategy. Yes, it'll make the big oil companies richer, but does it help Canada's economy overall to continue? After, how many 100 years have we been known as the hewers of wood and drawers of water? We need our own economy that processes our own resources here. No more shipping out raw logs, no more rip and ship economy. Process our own resources here for our economic advantage that stays local. This is not radical stuff, but most of what gets pitched to the Canadian public is how we grow our economy. By what? Again, just being vassals to mostly foreign corporations. Most of the companies that make up the membership of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers are only pretending to be Canadian. They're foreign corporations. They're taking our resources. The profits go elsewhere. We need to control our own resources and, to the greatest extent possible, process them here or hold them in strategic reserves where we only sell them to countries with whom we have shared values and want to expand trade away from the U.S. And those shared values should start with, we deal with other democracies that respect human rights. And no, we're not interested in cozying up to Saudi Arabia or the People's Republic of China just to grow our economy.
You were first elected as the leader of the Green Party in 2006, so it's some 20 years now since your first election. Have you failed, like as a leader and as a politician? Like because Scott Moe has won power, Daniel Smith has won power, Mark Carney has won power. In those 20 years, the Green Party doesn't seem to have persuaded enough Canadians to buy what you're selling.
Well,
what haven't you done to persuade more Canadians to come on board?
If we'd only gotten Justin Trudeau to keep his promise that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post. So justice for the New Democrats. The smaller parties in this country always face the fear factor threat that in a first past the post election, if you vote for the orange team or you vote for the green team, you've wasted your vote because we know it's going to be someone in a red sweater or a blue sweater that wins. Most democracies use fair voting, proportional representation. So it's not that I'm making excuses. My personal life, I have no question about saying I've been a failure at everything. I'm 71 years old, and I've been working since 1986 on the climate crisis, thinking that it would be like acid rain or the ozone protocol, that we would succeed and through government action avoid an extremely dangerous shift in our environment that threatens human survival.
What didn't you understand?
Well, I didn't understand the extent to which the rise of corporate rule and transnational corporate rule would undermine basic democracy. I can only take the responsibility that I feel desperately personally that I'm failing my grandchildren, and that's why I'm not going away. I certainly am looking forward to the leadership race for the Greens because I've tried to leave leadership in the past, hoping that new leadership would do better. And I'm quite certain that this moment is the moment where that will be the case. But when the next leadership race is over, it hasn't started yet, et cetera. But I'm looking forward to turning over the baton to someone else. But I'm not intending to leave Parliament. I'm not giving up the fight. I have an obligation to my own children and grandchildren, as does everyone my age who's listening to this. We're not allowed to say, oh, well, we tried. No, the boomers, we all have an obligation from wherever we find ourselves and whatever perch we find ourselves to form common cause with our young people, form common cause with Indigenous land defenders, and say, no, the rapacious colonizers, who in this case are dig oil or whatever, those in the billionaire class who think they don't have enough, have no right to continue to rob from our children their future in plain sight without holding them to account and without using the tools we have. God, we are so lucky in this democracy of Canada that we have the tools to continue to say, we will hold you accountable. Whoever you are elected leader, we'll hold you to account and we'll organize with our fellow citizens until it becomes inevitable that you do the right thing. Or sort of like Winston Churchill's great line about Americans, that when they've exhausted all the options, then they'll do the right thing. I feel that way about the current class of political leadership in Canada. When they've exhausted all the options, perhaps eventually they'll do the right thing. That which is necessary must be possible.
What does the Green Party have to offer Canadians that they can't get in the NDP?
Oh, principle. The NDP has been a party on paper against first past the post, yet they've formed government in province after province without changing the voting system. And the Greens are a grassroots democracy. So if you elect a Green MP, the difference is that your MP is responsible to listen to constituents and vote as their constituents would want you to vote. It's actually not possible in the Green Party to have a whipped vote because it violates our rules. So in the NDP, and I've seen times when NDP members have had to vote against their own platform because they're told to, in the same way that Liberals vote against their own platform or Conservatives do if they're told to. So whipped voting and controlling MPs through political party backroom domination is very anti-democratic. So what we offer voters is the accountability that says we understand as members of parliament that we work for you. And that's profoundly important to Canadians who think about you want to elect someone to represent you. That's our system of government. We are not in a presidential system, although it is increasingly covered in elections, as it were. This last election was probably the worst example where it was as though voters were going to be given a choice between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. And obviously, you could only vote for Pierre Poilievre if you lived in Carleton. And next election, you can only vote for Pierre Poilievre if you live in Battle River Crowfoot. But we don't have a presidential system. We have a Westminster parliamentary democracy where each voter votes for the member of parliament to represent them. And if voters are okay with the idea that their MP will follow the dictates of their leader and ignore what their local voters want them to do, then keep voting the way you always voted. To answer your question, what do we have to offer? It's grassroots democracy and the commitment to always be accountable to our own voters and work in service to the people we represent.
Final question, Elizabeth May. If your 20-something self were to come to you and say, Elizabeth May, what can I take from your experiences over over these last 50 years that will inform my own journey? What would you tell that young Elizabeth May?
I don't think I've changed enough to be able to give my younger self advice. Just, never give up. And fight like hell. Because the forces arrayed against us are more powerful than you think. But, again, it's a matter of deep faith in democracy that when you live in a country that does choose its leadership through democratic processes, invest in those processes, invest in making sure that public education doesn't lag behind the science. And it's never too late to get governments to do the right thing. And I don't think I would give myself very different advice than what I was doing in my 20s. What's changed is that, as I said, the corporate takeover of governments is something I didn't see coming. Cutting my teeth on environmental issues in the 1970s in Nova Scotia, where the Nova Scotia government chose to ignore and to actually decide against the very clear demands of a large pulp and paper company in our community that said, if you don't spray, we will close the mill and put 2,000 people out of work. Again, that decision in the 1970s from the Nova Scotia government to say no and not poison our forests was of the same order of courage of in the 1980s, the Ontario government saying no to Inco when they tried job blackmail, threatening to close down. I don't know today if I can think of a single provincial premier or prime minister in Canada over the last 10 years, 15 years, easily. Not so, maybe 20 years. I could have imagined Paul Martin saying no to job blackmail, but his government fell in 2005. So let's say the last time I saw a government that I thought had political courage was 2005 in this country. So that's 20 years of increasing corporate rule and playing the role of lackeys to the billionaire class. That's something Canadians don't need to tolerate. We can, and I would say to my 20-year-old self, just, fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a little tougher than you thought. But we have to come through this. just as my parents' generation, and they didn't know Hitler was on track to lose. You don't know. But you do know that you have an obligation to do the right thing and fight like hell.
The impossible is possible?
That's the biggest mistake people make about politics, is thinking it's the art of the possible. It's actually the art of the impossible.
Elizabeth May, thanks so much.
Thank you, Adrian.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time. A big thank you to our podcast's very first sponsor, founding local partner Perfect Books Ottawa, an independent bookstore on Elgin Street in downtown Ottawa. Perfect Books has become an Ottawa institution, and like independent bookstores everywhere, is a vital part of cultural life in the nation's capital. Head over to Perfect Books to pick up your latest read, or go to their website. Let them know we sent you.